Welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Today's topic is threats to the health of Pennsylvania's forests. And with us is Andrew Rohrbaugh, Section Chief for the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry's Division of Forest Health, where he helps protect Pennsylvania's forested ecosystems from the insects, diseases, and invasive plants that threaten them. Welcome. We're happy to have you back for another Learn at Lunchtime program.
Happy to be here.
So tell us a bit about yourself and the work you do with the Bureau of Forestry.
I grew up and live in South Central Pennsylvania. I was lucky enough to start working for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which has several different bureaus. Most people are familiar with state parks, which is one of our bureaus, but I work for the Bureau of Forestry, which manages 2.2 million acres of state forest land, is the jurisdictional agency for forest across the state and native wild plants. And so I work in our Division of Forest Health, which tries to help protect our forest ecosystems from insect diseases and most recently invasive plants.
Well, let's get started to find out more about today's topic. So as you begin to share your screen, I'm going to remind the audience that if anyone has a question during the presentation, to please submit it using the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation is complete. So Andrew, go ahead and begin.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, I'm really here to talk about the threats to the health of Pennsylvania's forests here today. I kind of gave a little bit of information about who I work for and what it is we attempt to do here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So let's talk about what is forest health. And I should say to begin with, I'm going to run through some of this general information about forest health, what it is we do about these things, and then hopefully at the end here, I'll have time to get into some of the specific issues that we're facing right now in our state. So to start off, forest health, it's a long definition here. Oh, hang on a second. I'm sorry, my slide is not. There we go. A long definition here I meant to have up on the screen a second ago, so people could read through it. This is kind of very long-winded, but I want to kind of simplify it a little bit. And it boils down to, we need forests as humans. We want our forests to be able to sustain themselves. And we have to think about that sustainability and the health of the forest in a different scales, spatial and temporal scales. So obviously you can take a forest that we've done a timber sale, and you can look at that acreage and say, well, that's not a healthy forest, there's no trees there. But if there is a regeneration of trees on a spatial scale, it is. And of course, if we don't have forests that are in early successional states, like after a timber sale or some kind of storm event, we don't have early successional habitat for a lot of our other species, like a lot of our birds that require those early successional habitat. So, you really have to think of these things in almost like a mosaic of the time as well as the space, a holistic view of what a forest is. Let's see. So you might not think about a single tree in terms of forest health. You can certainly think about that tree as being healthy or unhealthy. But when you start looking in the background, there's some chunks of forested land here. You might start thinking about that as a forest health, in terms of, is that small parcel of forest healthy? Is that small parcel part of a contiguous larger amount of parcels that have, healthy or unhealthy patches? What is it looking like on that larger landscape? And of course, if you look on a large enough landscape, we're looking at our state, Pennsylvania. We have 16 million acres of forests in Pennsylvania. That's about 60% of our land total. 2.2 million acres of that is under DCNR's jurisdiction. We have about 134 species of trees. I say about because it depends on how much you want to be with what's a shrub, what's a tree. Is this a subspecies of tree or two separate species? Some people are lumpers, some are splitters. So forest health, we're looking at this on a big picture. We're also able to narrow that down to a smaller geographic scale. Why do we care about forest health? Well, turn of last century, as I'm sure many of you are aware, we had actually pretty much deforested, logged over most of our state. So you can look and see at historical photos of what things looked like at the time, in terms of how badly we had denuded our forest in Pennsylvania. And this had all kinds of impacts throughout the state. And of course, one of the biggest reasons that people started thinking we need to protect our forest wasn't actually for the trees. Some of it was for timber value in the future, but it was because they realized that by cutting all these mountains and denuding them of forest and getting rid of the forest, we actually had impacts to our drinking water. So the rain that fell in those mountains would wash straight off the mountains, straight into the stream there, create huge floods, and not actually hold any water in the soil and the groundwater, cleanse it of any kind of pollutants, and slowly release it during the summer when we might have droughts. So they started protecting a lot of our mountain areas and forests because that was a good way to protect public drinking supplies. Of course, with that, loss of forests and soils, we can lose a lot of our soil, or a lot of our forests. We can lose a lot of our soils to erosion. Tree roots and healthy forest ecosystems, the diversity of native plants do a great job of holding onto our soil, helping to protect a lot of the values we want in those areas and protect our drinking water. Forests help to clean our air. So obviously, if trees in an area, they are photosynthesizing, they're pulling in air, and by doing so, they actually help to scrub some pollutants out of the surrounding air. One that people don't think of, and really I'm starting to try and bring more and more to the forefront in presentations like this, is we protect forests because they conserve and preserve a lot of carbon. So when trees are photosynthesizing, they're putting on growing and they're adding wood, and that's actually taking carbon out of our atmosphere, sequestering it in a pretty good way that we can hold on to that and keep it out of the atmosphere. And when we start thinking about the health of our forests, obviously you lose some of that carbon back to the atmosphere when you log an area or whatnot. But we're losing and having impacts to the health of a lot of our tree species due to insects and diseases, which someone actually did a scientific paper recently, and they calculated out that our forests here in the East, because of introduced invasive insects and diseases, are actually sequestering a lot less carbon than they would be if they didn't have those health factors going against them. And it's really causing us to emit even more, about as much carbon, the same magnitude as what's emitted by Western wildfires that we're all so familiar with at this point due to the smoke impacts. So you just don't see it. The sun doesn't become hazy during those bad smoke days like from the invasive insects and diseases. So it's kind of unseen and unthought of, but that's why I'm trying to highlight that in presentations like this. Of course, we like to protect our forests because humans like to use timber for things. So using timber for durable hardwood products like houses or things that are going to be around for a long time is actually quite a good way to continue to sequester carbon, because if we allow trees to regrow on that site, they'll take up more carbon, and we're using that wood product instead of something like concrete or steel that emits more carbon. Of course, we like to protect our forests for wildlife value. I'm sure many people are on this call and are avid bird watchers and enjoy seeing wildlife. And without forests, we would have far less wildlife. Some of our forest species produce food, which these are ones that I really like, native service berries and pawpaws. But I figured one that everyone could probably get behind is maple syrup, coming from native maple trees that grow here in the Northeast. I just had some this morning. Of course, we like our forest trees and trees in urban areas, which can be considered forests in some instances, for shade, and of course, forested areas for recreation. So that's why we're worried about forest health. So some of the things that can impact forest health. We have abiotic factors, which are non-living factors. So you can think of these as things like drought, excessive moisture, pollution, um, high or low temperatures, wind damage. And so when you look at some of our forests in the state, you start to see damage from some of these abiotic factors. Obviously, something like that top right picture, a wind throw event like that, you can pretty clearly tell what happened to those trees and why they, as a tree stand, do not look healthy. Wind throw events are a natural part of forest ecosystems, and does not mean that the entire forest is unhealthy. Once again, looking at it from a slightly larger scale, it just means that this part of the forest is going back to an earlier succession stage. Of course, you can look at other things like that bottom left picture. You can see something's going on there. Probably salt damage from the roadside, although maybe someone went along and sprayed herbicide or something like that. That's abiotic damage from chemicals. And then you have something like the bottom right, which probably one of my specialists that work in my division could tell me, oh, that's this or that's that. But for general folks like you and I'd put myself in that category. When I look at a leaf that looks like those leaves on the bottom right, I can't quite tell, was that some kind of excessive damage from a drought or even from excessive moisture. Um, Drought, obviously, folks can think of harming trees, but when we have really high precipitation years, like we had a few years back in the spring, we have a lot of damage from diseases like anthracnose that can harm our trees. So sometimes when you get a tree that looks like that, it's really hard to tell what's going on. It could be a biotic factor, it could be an abiotic factor. That's when you need to start calling in people who are frankly smarter than me and can look at that and try to deduce what those symptoms are meaning for your tree stand. So a lot of what we can't do a lot about a lot of those biotic factors. Climate change is making some of those worse. But we really do concentrate a lot of our efforts on biotic factors to forest health. Um, don't feel too bad if you don't want to take a lot of time reading down this long list of species on the left. To give you a general idea, these are mostly insects and diseases that impact our trees here in Pennsylvania. Some of these are native insects and diseases, and our forests have evolved to deal with those. And oftentimes they don't cause significant damage to our tree species. Not never, but oftentimes it's not anything too horrible in terms of on a large scale. But for some of these, the diseases and insects that we're most concerned about, they are invasive species. So they came to the US. Let me advance my slide here. They came to the US from different areas of the globe, which unfortunately, our forest did not evolve with those insects and diseases and don't have a lot of useful defenses. Either our trees aren't able to defend themselves with their own, genetic capabilities, or also, we might not have other insects and diseases that keep those in check. So that's an issue. Those are the ones that cause the most damage to our forest health. We do see damage from native insects and diseases, but not nearly on the same scale. And I'll get to that a little bit later. So to give another example here of showing the pressure, obviously here in the Northeast, we've got a lot of ports, we've got a lot of forests, and so that's on a lot of population. So that's a lot of pressure for introducing non-native forest insects and diseases. So we've got a lot of problems here. You don't have to study this graph too quickly, but it just shows that we are continuing due to global trade and movement of material to introduce insects and diseases. And another issue that we've got, which is particularly bad here in the Northeast, mostly especially southeastern Pennsylvania, south central Pennsylvania, is invasive plants. Now, these don't directly typically kill our forest, although we do have invasive trees that can outcompete our things like our oaks and maples. So I'm thinking about something like Paulownia tree or tree of heaven. Um, but invasive plants, even more than just those invasive tree species, when you go into a lot of areas, you can see that the understory of the forest is highly invaded. Um, and those can cause a lot of impacts to the current health of our forest ecosystems and the values for which we appreciate them. But it can also cause issues when you do have something like a disease mortality event or a wind throw event where you lose that overstory, and the invasive plants can cause a lot of difficulty with regenerating a healthy forest of native trees. So let me see if I can. So in terms of invasive plants, I'm not going to go through a whole list of them here, but we do have DCNR is not a jurisdictional agency for invasive plants, but we're concerned about them because of the impacts on our native insect or native plants and trees. So we have a species list of invasive plants, things that we consider invasive when we find them on our properties. That is online if you just Google DCNR invasive plants. Um, and we're concerned about these because in a lot of cases, we've seen them inhibiting native tree regeneration. So this is a picture of Angelica tree. You can see how densely that species is growing in this area. It makes it very challenging for our native species to repopulate this area after a timber sale or some kind of mortality event. Similarly, arrested succession pathways. This is a picture of kudzu down south. Fortunately, it's not quite as aggressive up here in this area yet. But once you get kudzu established in an area like this, it's really not going to ever be anything other than a kudzu stand without human interaction or intervention here. Like I said on that forest floor, this is a healthy forest maybe in the canopy, but on that first forest floor, this garlic mustard has pretty much excluded all of our native spring ephemeral wildflowers, which are the hosts and pollination sources for a lot of our native invertebrates and insects, pollinators. So we want to try to um, think about our forest health holistically as an ecosystem, including those species. And so with invasive plants, I'd just like to show these slides real quick. It's one of those things where it helps to look at your property and catch something like Phragmites when it looks like this. And before you have a stand that looks like this, clearly you're not going to get a lot of tree species that are going to survive to grow up through that. And similarly, Japanese knotweed, something like this is a lot easier to deal with than when you got a stand like this, excluding all of our tree species from growing and native plant species in general. And I just wanted to include this picture because I think it's a great example. This is from the Ambler Station in eastern Pennsylvania. This is a site where they had a heavy ash overstory. Unfortunately, ash got hammered by emerald ash borer, and they lost a lot of those tree species. And then they actually had a tornado that came through here and knocked a lot of other tree species over due to that high wind event. And unfortunately, we're here because most of what you see in that understory is non-native invasive species, plants, which have taken advantage of the additional light and just exploded. And coupling that with just a few too many deer per acre, you can see what kind of impact these invasive plants have in preventing this forest from ever becoming, habitat for much, and even from regenerating in any kind of reasonable time scale to a healthy forest stand again. So what do we do about all these species that impact our forest health? Like I said, I went over why we care about forest health, what it is and why we care about it. I've gone over some of those general impacts from insects, diseases, and invasive plants. And so here's what we can do about them. First of all, we do a lot of training, education, and outreach. It's why I'm here right now doing this presentation to help folks learn about these issues and hopefully be able to tackle a little bit on their own and advocate for more resources to go towards forest health in the state. Penn's Woods. Um, we also do in our division here in forest health, we do a lot of inventory and monitoring. So we do actually fly the state doing aerial surveys um, to try and see where we have defoliation and mortality of trees. This is actually a picture on the right of our one of our spray blocks for spongy moths. So you can see that green in the center there. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse on the screen, but that whole green block in the center is a place where we sprayed for spongy moth, and everything else around it has been defoliated. Um, so might not kill the oak trees and the surrounding trees in that area, but certainly going to weaken them in the future. This is what our aerial survey coverage actually looks like in the state. So we fly about on this year. What year was this? 2022. We flew a total of 14,800 acres. So most of the forested land in the state we actually cover, trying to figure out what caused mortality and defoliation. And I actually map that out And then in a lot of instances, if we're not sure what's going on, we will actually send out folks to ground truth what's going on in that site. So I just wanted to go through some maps of how forest health has looked like in Pennsylvania over the last few years. So this is the kind of map that we generate from that data. And you can see up in the north central, we had a native defoliator there, cherry scallop shell moth, a little bit of fall cankerworm, also native. But most of the defoliation and damage caused this year was from red, which is what used to be known as gypsy moth. We now refer to as spongy moth. And I'm not going to go through every single one of these years, but you can see kind of we still have some of that native cherry scallop shell moth defoliation damage causing there. You see we start picking up loss of ash due to emerald ash borer. Still had some spongy moth going on there. 2018, this was the year I mentioned where we had a very heavy spring precipitation, and it actually caused a lot of anthracnose to break out in the southern and south central areas. And that actually caused a lot of damage to our chestnut oaks, especially on those ridgetop areas. And you can see that spongy moth kind of collapsed. Cherry scallop shell moth is starting to wane a little bit. And now you can barely pick up cherry scallop shell moth. We saw damage from periodical cicada that year. We were picking up more loss of our ashes due to emerald ash borer. Spongy moth pretty much collapsed by this year. 2020, once again, we started having very little spongy moth that year, which is great. And we had an outbreak of a native insect, fall webworm, in the southeast. But we had a huge frost event that year that did actually cause damage across our state. So that's an abiotic factor, like I mentioned. Then 2021, Lymantria dispar, that spongy moth, that reared its ugly head again. And you'll notice now how much mortality that caused and damage and mortality, defoliation mortality, I guess I should say, across the state. Same thing with 2022. Same thing with 2023, as well as frost damage once again. And I just wanted to pause on this one and mention, you can see that frost can cause a lot of damage, a lot of defoliation, and spongy moth can cause a lot of defoliation. A lot of our tree species have evolved to be able to kind of take a hit. They can lose their leaves, they can leaf back out. It's a loss of energy, but they're kind of evolved to deal with some of that. But when you start dealing with not just the occasional outbreak of a native defoliator, like maybe fall cankerworm or fall webworm, but you also deal with these huge outbreaks of spongy moth that just hammer the trees year after year after year. And then you have frost on top of that. So even if a tree manages to escape spongy moth for a year, it gets hit by an abiotic event like frost or anthracnose due to high precipitation levels. You can see the kind of impacts this can start having on those tree species. And in 2024, once again, we had high levels of spongy moth. It does seem to be waning. So we're hoping to have a much smaller spongy moth outbreak this year based off our surveys. But now we're starting to see a little bit of fall cankerworm, a native tree, native defoliator down in the southwest that's starting to pop up. Still, that native defoliator, that fall cankerworm down in the southwest, not causing nearly as much impact as what spongy moth did last year. So you can see the differences that an invasive insect or disease can cause in terms of damaging forest health. And you can see that, we actually do calculate out how much defoliation takes place versus actual mortality in a year. I did want to at least mention that we do invasive plant inventory. So these are points that have been taken on state forest land in our own internal tracker. And we share that data with citizen science websites like EdMaps and IMAP Invasives. So, and they also pull information from places like iNaturalist. So if you're looking for something that some way you can help, going out, taking your smartphone, starting to upload points in terms of what invasive plants you see. A lot of the new apps have things that if you have internet access, they can try to identify the species based on AI. Not always accurately, but it's getting better. So what can we do other than take that inventory? First of all, sometimes there's not a lot we can do, and we just lose a stand and hope that we can, salvage harvest it, get some use out of the wood, and set it up for a good regeneration into a new timber sale. For some things, like southern pine beetle, you can actually look at isolating infected areas to try to slow the spread of an outbreak. So that's what you see here in this picture. For things like oak wilt, you can actually try to sever root connections between trees to slow the spread of the disease between root systems where roots have grafted between two different trees. You can do trapping. So this is an example of a purple trap that was put out. These are mostly used for monitoring, but it is a physical control of an insect. You can hand pull stuff. So this is a much younger me attempting to hand pull barberry at a site where we had rare plants and we're trying to avoid chemical use. So that is something you can do in some cases. It's very challenging to do physical control like this effectively, though. That's why oftentimes we do use chemical control. So I'm not going to linger on this too much, but the biggest chemical control we do in the state is probably our spongy moth control and suppression program, where we do fly thousands of acres in a year to try to suppress that insect. There's pros and cons to that approach, and I'm happy to address any of those if anyone has questions after the program. We also do individual tree treatments, like these direct trunk injections for emerald ash borer. We suppress things like hemlock woolly adelgid with soil or trunk or basil bark sprays. And for invasive plants, oftentimes we do sprays like this on foliar to try and target things, kill them in the understory. We also work on biological controls. So we've released biological controls for hemlock woolly adelgid and elongate hemlock scale. Emerald ash borer, we've released 4 different parasitoid wasp species that go after emerald ash borer. And this is more of my specialty area. We don't have a lot, but we do have some species for which biocontrols are available for invasive plants. So we've used them for spotted knapweed, purple loosestrife, mile-a-minute, and we are still hoping that we will get approval to have verticillium wilt for ailanthus tree, which is tree of heaven. So now I'd like to go through a couple of newer species. And the reason I kind of want to go through these with folks is because these are the ones when I mentioned about doing citizen science and trying to find new inventory points. These are the ones we really want people to keep their eye out for. Someone reporting they have spongy moth, unfortunately, is not going to tell us a lot because we have spongy moth across the whole state. But some of these species are ones we really want the public to be keeping an eye out for because the sooner we can hit these, that we consider them early detection, rapid response species. So wavy leaf basket grass is one that's spreading in from Maryland and Virginia. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on any of these, but this is a low-growing grass species. Looks about the same size as stilt grass, which you can also see in this picture. But one of the things to really key on them for this species is it's going to grow really low along the ground. It's going to almost prostrate to the ground. It's going to actually have a very distinct waviness to the leaves. So if you see something like this, like I said, even in this picture on the left, you can see that waviness on the leaves. We do have some native and other non-native species that look like it. Frankly, if you see anything that you're concerned about, I would highly encourage you to take a picture, take a point, and then send that information to your local county extension office or email me or put it into one of our invasive trackers or iNaturalist. We do try to comb through that data and pull out new points that need treatment. That's kind of what infestations look like for wavy leaf basket grass. They just tend to creep along the ground and take over everything. And the seeds are sticky, so they get on everything, including pets. The next species I'd like people to keep an eye out for, particularly, is Asian longhorn borer, or Asian longhorn beetle. And the best way to identify this one is if you see a pretty large beetle. I mean, this is going to be, not quite the size of your thumb, but it's going to be a pretty hefty beetle with white and black spots and antenna like that, long antenna. If you see something like that, please capture it, take some good pictures, send that information in. The reason we really want to keep an eye out for this one is this one turns maples into Swiss cheese. Unfortunately, it's quite aggressive. Um, the good thing about this one is it has been introduced several different times across the eastern seaboard, and it does not seem to spread very quickly. So if you can actually find it early, there's been a number of eradication programs that have been very successful. So we're really hoping this is one that if we do find it in Pennsylvania, we find it early so that we can do a good job eradicating it before it attacks all of those maples that make us delicious, delicious maple syrup. Another one we want the public to keep an eye out for, sudden oak death. This is a disease that, as you can guess from the name, kills oaks quite suddenly. We do not have any known um, occurrences on the East Coast, but uh, identification for this one as a fungus is you'll find these kind of like pressure pads that canker wounds that grow underneath the bark on an oak tree. They might seep black or red liquid, um, and it's only been found in California thus far, I believe. Um, and we are doing surveys across parts of Pennsylvania. But if you see something, your oak tree in your yard or your tree, stand of trees starts dying quite quickly, please, if you see anything like that, once again, take pictures, take a point, send something to someone. We'd rather have to comb through a couple extra emails to make sure that we can get on top of something like that as soon as possible. Another one that's fairly new in Pennsylvania, hasn't become quite widespread yet, Japanese angelica tree. Um, you can see the map there. We do have it in parts of Western Pennsylvania, North Central, South Central. There is a fairly good population, unfortunately, in Eastern Pennsylvania down in the Philadelphia region. Um, but this is one that I showed the picture earlier of it kind of taking over a timber sale. Um, and it has large compound leaves, some of which have a spike at the end. Um, Probably the best identification for this is that, this is the kind of tree that you do not want to grab onto in the forest. A large amount of spines all over its stems. Um, we do have a native tree species that's closely related, Hercules club. Um, this is in the same genus. And the best way to identify Angelica tree is when it's flowering. It has that very drooping form. So all of those flowers stalks come off of one central point and kind of droop off to the side. I like to compare that to our native Hercules club or Devil's Walking, which you can actually see tends to have a much more upright flower with a central leader to it, where a lot of the flowers come off of that central stem. It becomes a lot harder to tell um, our native from the non-native when they're fruiting because the fruit, even if you have like a central stem, tends to pull the whole flower system down. It's hard to tell whether it's drooping from one point or on a central leader. This is what a tree looks like from a little further away. Like I said, it's kind of harder to identify when it's fruiting like this, but you'll see it oftentimes in higher light environments along the edges of disturbance. And like I said, they can be quite aggressive. And here you can see that flower in the central picture. Beech leaf disease is a fairly new one. Unfortunately, this is one we have across the state. It swept across the state quite quickly. But you can kind of keep an eye out for this in your own property. It's actually caused by a nematode, which is essentially a microscopic worm. I'm sorry if there's anyone here who is a nematode specialist. I know that's probably making you cringe right now, that description, but because they're not related to earthworms very closely. Um, but basically, I'm not going to read through all this, but it causes a lot of leaf mortality when it gets into the buds. It can infect the leaves and cause the tree to lose its leaves and even have mortality. So we're still seeing how this one plays out. It's actually a picture of the nematode. This is an old picture. You can see this is 2021. This is when we knew it. And now we know it's across the whole state. So this spread quite quickly. Um, and I think the best picture I want to show for folks for this is this one. And if you're beech beech trees start looking a little ratty like this and losing their leaves, you might suspect it. But if you look up at the bottom of the leaves up against the daylight, you'll see this characteristic banding, dark bands versus light bands, and that's a diagnostic feature of beech leaf disease. And Beth, it's 12:50. I can stop now. I can go on forever in terms of tree insects and diseases and invasive plants. So
You
it's
go
totally
on.
up to you.
You have a few more to do?
I can go, yeah, just cut me off, okay?
Okay.
So I figured I'd go through beech bark disease next. This is actually a non-native fungus and scale insect. And the scale insect feeds on the bark of our beech trees, injects the fungus, and instead of a native healthy beech tree like this, you wind up seeing a lot of scale damage, the fungus growing out of the bark like this. Sorry, I was smart enough to put that picture next instead of having to go back. And what you wind up having is damage to your beech trees that look like this, and eventually they will succumb mostly to this disease. Unfortunately, this was one that spreads very slowly. So you can see it's been around since 1890 in Nova Scotia, and slowly spread through the East Coast. It's still making its way through Pennsylvania. Um, so that's one to keep an eye out for, particularly in that south central, southeastern area of the state, and report it if you see it. There's a better map of where we currently are aware of it. I can talk about emerald ash borer here, which is pretty much swept through the entire state. So reporting this one isn't quite as a priority. But I did want to mention, we have 16 species of ash across the US, 8 billion trees, and this emerald ash borer wound up having something like 99% mortality rate for adult trees. So even though we only had four ash species and it was only 3.6% of our forest cover, that's pretty much been knocked out. And 3.6 doesn't sound like much, but as you keep introducing these non-native insects and diseases, you keep having these impacts, and it impacts our forest ecosystems quite severely over time. I'm going to skip over the chemical injection for this one, although if you have an ash tree that hasn't yet been killed by emerald ash borer, you can protect it with uh, pesticides very quite effectively. You can see this picture of one on the left has been treated, the ones on the right have not been. Um, like I said, we released a number of parasitoid wasps to help cut down on the number of emerald ash borer that are impacting our trees. And this is something I wanted to get to with folks. I'm not sure I have time to get to hemlock as well, but we are asking that people keep an eye out for healthy ash trees across Pennsylvania, especially in the western areas where emerald ash borer hit first. Because if you see a healthy ash tree out there, chances are it has a genetic component that has made it somewhat more resistant to emerald ash borer. And we here at Forest Health Division just managed to hire a geneticist whose job has been tasked with trying to use some of those lingering ash trees and try to collect seed and material for them to help with breeding programs to try to breed resistance to emerald ash borer back into the species for use across the state. Similarly, if you are in the south central or even central part of Pennsylvania and you have healthy hemlock trees, you might want to start considering like, hey, I found this hemlock and the ones around it look pretty bad, or found a little stand of hemlocks that look pretty good. That might be something you might want to consider reporting to Bureau of Forestry. And there is actually an app that you can use to report those called Tree Snap that I would recommend that people download and use if you are, finding a number of those. Um, I already mentioned that for hemlock, but the issue we've got with hemlock is hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a small scale that actually feeds on the sap of hemlocks. That's what it actually looks like zoomed up. It's caused significant mortality of hemlocks, particularly in southern areas, and it is continuing to spread through Pennsylvania. Um, So you can see at this point, this map is a little bit out of date. We just found it in all of the counties in Pennsylvania this year. So it now is across the whole state. Similarly, we do a lot of hemlock surveys, and this is kind of what our map of data looks like. We also have elongate hemlock scale, which instead of feeding on the twigs of the tree, the hemlock scale actually feeds on the needles itself. So those marks on the needles are either the scale or what's left behind after it's fed. And so that one, it has a little bit more of an eastern area distribution, but both are kind of impacting our hemlocks in Pennsylvania. That's why we're asking folks, particularly in that south central and central area, to keep an eye out for any suspiciously healthy hemlocks. Or as I horrified some of our younger co-workers the other meeting, I suggested we call them hemlock trees and ash trees with Riz, which for any of you that are as old as me, that's short for charisma. So we were trying to figure out a way to get it across to the public what we were looking for. Figured that way might hit with the younger crowd. I can't believe I'm old enough to be talking about the younger crowd now, but I am. So once again, you can use insecticides to really suppress HWA very effectively if you have a tree that you want to protect. Um, but on a larger landscape level, that's not really feasible. So we have been releasing biocontrols for that. Two species of beetles, Laricobius, but also a new silverfly, Leucotraxis, which we're hoping will help with that insect. And that one, like I said, we're also looking for potential disease-resistant individuals that might help us start a breeding program in the future. Okay, I can talk about spongy moth too, Beth. That's a huge
I,
one in Pennsylvania. It's not one I think that the public needs a lot of extra information on, but yeah, it's a huge impact. So I can stop there.
you know what I think this means? I think you need to come back in 2025 and do a program on spongy moths.
I can talk for a long time on spongy moth. It's been a huge impact in Pennsylvania. It's one of our major defoliators, but it's probably a good place to stop for now.
So go ahead and put your video on, and I'll provide you with some questions that we have from the Q&A. We just have a few more minutes, but one that there was a lot of questions on, and go ahead and you can turn off your screen share. Um, because you asked about, you mentioned spongy moth. So question was, why is North Central particularly regularly badly hit by spongy moth? And southern tier seems to experience less frequent damage. So what's the difference between spongy moth in the north central region and the southern tier?
I'm not entirely sure why that is. I'm newer. I started my career dealing with invasive plants, and it's only recent I've made my way into insects and diseases. That's when Forest Health Division kind of took on invasive plants. They hired me, and they're like, "Congratulations, everyone gets to deal with invasive plants now." And my coworkers are very thrilled about it. They needed more depressing news in their life, but I'm still learning about all these things. So if anyone has more questions, I can be happy to ask other folks. You can email me. I will say that I know that part of the issue is our north central area, especially, has just these large blocks of contiguous oak forests, a lot of dry, um, southwest facing slopes, which seem to be have they seem to be almost like the nucleus for an outbreak happening, which might have to do with some of the biocontrols that we have, a fungus and a virus, maybe not having quite the impact on those sites, and that allows the moths to be able to build their numbers and kind of explode from there. Um, so I think it's a matter of like high numbers of oaks, which are a preferred food source, um, contiguous amounts of oaks, and then, like I said, kind of those microclimates which might lead to outbreaks a little bit more readily, and then their ability to spread quite quickly from there. We do have outbreaks every year down in like the Michaud region where I'm at, just not quite to the same. I shouldn't say not quite to the same severity. People down there probably disagree, but yeah, not quite as large of an acreage.
So are there statistics about spotted lanternfly? It didn't look on the forest damage maps that there was much of an issue. Is that because of the amount of education that was put out about the insect before it took over Pennsylvania?
Spotted lanternfly, yes. So that is one where I do think public education has done a great job. It has been spreading across the state. Um, more than we like, but to be fair, much slower than it has moved across. I believe it invaded Korea. It spread across Korea significantly faster. We managed to slow the spread quite a bit in Pennsylvania. And even now, even if you look at like a map of like counties that are infested, it looks like a lot of the state, but those are discrete population areas like townships or areas within those counties that are infested. Um, we were quite concerned about spotted lanternfly having an impact on hardwoods in Pennsylvania, our forest. But more and more as the has gone on, we found out it really doesn't seem to have much impact on our native tree species. It does impact grapes. So I'm not aware of how much research has been done on our native grape species, but obviously if you're a vineyard, so it's a little bit more of an agricultural issue as we've figured out. Still probably not ideal, but nowhere near the same impact on our native trees as what we were concerned about initially.
How do you monitor the success or impact of the biological controls, such as parasitic wasps? And are they native or introduced?
Um, the biocontrols that are used are typically introduced from the native range of the insect or disease. They go through very rigorous testing at this point to make sure that they are not going to have unintended consequences. Nothing's 100%, but they are very, very careful about what species they introduce. A lot of testing goes into that, a lot of thought. Earlier biological control efforts were not quite that thought out and gave it a very, very bad black eye, rightfully so. Um, so measurement of their effects can be difficult in different species. We were just having a conversation with how we can do a better job quantifying the impact that the Laricobius and silverfly beetles and flies might be having on hemlock woolly adelgid. Um, so some are better studied and understood than others. I deal with mile-minute weevils, and so I know for them and purple loosestrife that the biocontrol has been quite effective in terms of dealing with. It's been well studied that it has a lot of effect on our invasive weeds like that. Not as much as we'd ever like in terms of effectiveness, but pretty effective overall in terms of being a help. I know I just saw one study a couple months ago that showed that the emerald ash borer parasitoids were controlling roughly 30% of the damage, I believe, of the emerald ash borer. Now, when you see pictures of, what ash trees look like when they're infested with the emerald ash borer, 30% is not going to protect our ash trees sufficiently. But if we can get some of these lingering ash trees with some genetic resistance, even if it's not 100%, and we can get those genetics out on the landscape, then a combination of some genetic resistance along with 30% less emerald ash borer pressure could do the trick.
I want to thank everyone for your questions. We do not have time to answer all of them today, but Andrew is happy to respond to your emails. His contact information was in the chat and will be sent to you via email as well. So, Andrew, what would you like the audience to remember from today's presentation?
I think probably just that, all our native ecosystems, not just forests, although those are very significant, important ecosystems of Pennsylvania, they provide us with a lot of services and benefits, and they require resources to protect them. We've done a really great job in the last few decades and conserving and regenerating our forests and protecting them from pollution like acid rain. And now we need to start focusing resources on invasive insects, diseases, and plants that are impacting our forest's ability to provide us with those things that we like wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, areas to recreate in. So I personally just went hiking through an area in southern New York on the Appalachian Trail, and I can tell you that hike was a lot less pleasant in 95 degrees due to the defoliation of the canopy cover from spongy moth. So it would have been much nicer they recreated in the forest had I been in the shade.
Thank you so much for today's presentation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. Visit the State Museum of Pennsylvania's website at statemuseumpa.org for program information and to sign up.